Alright, let's add some interactivity to our component because Wire is supposed to help us make our websites more dynamic with little to no JavaScript. Previously, we have learned that to pass variables from our PHP class to our template, we would pass them as additional argument in our render method. However, this can be achieved differently. Let me remove this bit we did before. And the alternative is that variables we want to be able to access on our template, we define them as public properties of our class. So we have the variable who before. Now we can define it as public who equals, and we assign the default value. We are still rendering the same variable in the template, and if we visit the page, I'm refreshing, we still get the same result. Let me remove this variable printing here. And yeah, let's think of it. This is a contact form, and most likely when you present user with a contact form, he would collect some data via some HTML inputs. I suggest we would try to collect the user name, and this name has to be stored somewhere. This is where our public properties of our component become very handy. I'm going to rename our who variable into name variable with an empty string as default value, and I'm also going to type hint it as a string. Now, in our template, let's create an input element with HTML so we can collect the name. Now, we need to connect this input with our property on our PHP class. How to do it? Wire has some special attributes for the HTML, which would do that for us. The attribute we need is wire semicolon model equals our property name. This is what we got on our page now. A simple input field doesn't do much for now. But to visualize the magic behind, let's print this name variable on the page. Again, in twig context, I can just print this variable as a twig variable. Some housekeeping is needed here to have a good view of the page. Back to our page. This is my input field, and whenever I am going to type something, the string will be updated instantly on the page. What's happening here? Let me open my network tab and notice that every time I'm typing a letter in the input field, a request is being made to our server. Looking into the requests body, we can see that in the request we are sending the previous value of our property name, and in the response it's not like we're getting an updated value, but instead the whole HTML generated by our template. Hopefully you can see how powerful this technique can be already, because think of it, literally with one HTML attribute and a very little PHP, we are able now to keep track of the values from our frontend in our backend and act accordingly as per our needs whenever we need. Let me give you another use case. Imagine you have a search functionality on your site, and while user is typing in the input, you would want to show already a preview of results. You would normally handle it by creating a controller and with JavaScript catch the events of keystrokes and make a request to the controller, return some JSON, parse the JSON, and replace the HTML with that JSON. However, with Wire, all you need is to define one attribute on the HTML input element and handle your logic in the PHP class, without dealing with any additional controller and other boilerplate. And here we have another question. Do we actually need to make a server request each time someone types a letter in our search box, or name box in this case? The answer is no. Most of the times you actually don't need it, but this is the default behavior of wire model. To change this behavior, we can add a modifier when defining our attribute, and the modifier is lazy. If we visit our page again, let me refresh it. While typing a string here, no requests are actually being sent to the server, and only after clicking outside the input, basically when the focus is moving, or either by clicking tab, only then the request is going to be performed. A different approach we can do to prevent too many requests being sent to our server is to use the debounce modifier, which is a way to delay the request to the server after a certain period of time. Let me set the debounce to 2 seconds. So now, when I'm typing, nothing is still being sent to the server, and only after 2 seconds it has been triggered. Moving on, wires support not only the inputs of type text, but any HTML inputs generally. For example, we can turn a select dropdown into a wire model. Let me create one, and I'll be identifying this wire model with the name reason. I'm doing this purely to add some logic to our contact form. Going to add some options. So when the form is being submitted, a user would be able to choose the reason they are contacting us. As we defined our model in the template, we need to use the same name in our PHP class as a public property. And we need to print the variable in Twig template so we can visualize its effect. Back to our browser. When I'm typing in the input field, everything behaves the same. And when I select an option from the dropdown, another request is being made to the server, and I'm being returned the model value. Alright, this worked. And until now, we were always defining the default value of our properties as empty strings, but we can define specific value which would act as default value. With a default value, when I'm visiting the page, on initial render, we have already pre-populated the value, and if we change it works as before. Alright, hopefully by now we got familiar with the idea that each live updates on the page are being triggered by a specific event, mostly JavaScript events, which pretty much means that our template is being rendered over and over again. And this brings a benefit that we can use literally anything Twig has to offer, and I'm specifically referring to conditions. Let me bring you an example in form of dependent fields. This is quite a common pattern in Drupal to show a specific field based on the value of another field, and this is usually handled with states property on a renderable array. While with Wire there is no magic or any specific API involved for this, and we can use literally Twig if statements. Let me show you. I'll use Twig if statement to check if the selected reason is equals to help. If true, an additional text area will be exposed for the users to fill in. Otherwise, if users are leaving a feedback, I just want to expose an input field of type number, which would represent the score they give us. Let's have a look in the browser. Refreshing the page. And yes, since we have help as a default value already set for our dropdown, We have our text area exposed, but when we switch to feedback, a different field is being exposed to us. Pretty cool if you ask me. Now, let's make a step further and assume that we want to allow our users to provide a feedback and ask for help in the same time. And for this, I will make my select box to accept multiple options. I'll add multiple attributes to my select. The select dropdown is now not a dropdown but a multiple select. And the consequences of this is that our reason is not a string anymore because it should hold multiple values, so it becomes an array with default value respectively as an empty array. Since reason variable is now not a string anymore, but instead an array, this condition is no good anymore. I need to handle it as an array. While Twig is perfectly fine to handle this situation, I feel more comfortable writing my code in pure PHP. I'll set a condition that if help has been chosen, basically it's in our reason array, actually, let me first define a variable where I'll store my result condition. So if help is in the reason, I'll set that I need to show help dependent field. We'll do the same check for feedback value. And this show variable can be passed to our template to be used there. Let's see if this works. Refreshing the page. I'm choosing help and it didn't work. Let's see why. I see. I have used the attribute name, but option would expect the attribute value. Let's correct this. If you look back at our page. Alright, now when I select help, I get my dependent field in the help. And also the second value would expose the dependent field for feedback. Nice. Okay. Now I would like to give you one more example when we have an input checkbox. And this checkbox will also be a model. So we'll create one input with the attribute wire model equals terms and of type checkbox. Also, I'm going to remove this reason because this is actually an array and causes warnings on my web page. We'll use tweak conditioning for all this and we'll say if terms, or better say not terms, basically if it's not checked, we'll say please accept our terms. And we need to define our model as a public property on our component PHP class. So I'll use public, and since the checkbox I need a boolean type hinting terms equals false by default. Let's check the browser. And I'm ticking, but it doesn't disappear. Let me see. I see I misspelled the model. Refreshing the page. Okay, now when I'm ticking, the condition evaluates to true, so the text doesn't come. Alright, this is the basics you would need to know about the models. And I just want to say that having these tools to me personally brought a lot of power because as a backend developer, I was always struggling to come up with some JavaScript solutions to make my interactions on the front end. But now, with minimal effort, I can achieve very beautiful effects and interactions for my users. For additional information and use cases, make sure to check the properties documentation, where I'm exposing some more examples and use cases.